अच्छा, ठीक है सर, ठीक है, थैंक यू।
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर। सर मैं माजिद बोल रहा हूँ, आपकी आवाज़ आ रही है।
ओके, थैंक यू।
इसमें इनकी ये आवाज़ें तो नहीं आई।
इसमें तो नहीं आना चाहिए।
हाँ, मैंने माइक बंद की हुई है।
मुझे पता तो मैं
अस्सलाम
तो
वालेकुम डॉक्टर महमूद खालिद साहब,
आपकी
आप
वॉइस
अपनी
आती है।
प्रेजेंटेशन खुद अपलोड कर सकते हैं, स्क्रीन शेयर कर लें।
आपको नजर आ रही है मेरी प्रेजेंटेशन?
हाँ, बिल्कुल नज़र आ रही है, थैंक यू। अब आपको आवाज़ भी क्लियर है महमूद साहब?
जी, मुझे आवाज आपकी क्लियर आ
जी ठीक है, आप भी, आपकी आवाज़ भी क्लियर है, आपकी प्रेजेंटेशन भी नज़र आ रही है। जस्ट हम 1 से 2 मिनट के अंदर स्टार्ट लेते हैं।
ठीक हो।
ठिक त होस्, यो क्लास सुरु दे هغه آنلاین مې جوین کړی دی، نو هغه ختم شي نو بیا کوم.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। अस्सलाम वालेकुम। Okay. On behalf of Chairperson and Faculty of Department of Economics, University of Peshawar, I welcome you all in this webinar on a very, very important issue related to Pakistan's economy. Tax reforms are more often debated in academic circles. Tax policy is mostly criticized by businesses and common citizens, of course, for obvious reasons, and it is also an area of interest for donors. This webinar has been arranged primarily for students of Department of Economics, and it has a very simple objective of looking at consistency between theory and practice in case of tax policy of Pakistan. Students of economics, we believe that every public policy has single ultimate goal, and that is maximum social welfare. We also know that social welfare cannot be maximized without economic growth, as economic growth is highly correlated with social and human development indicators. So economic growth can be taken as an intermediate objective of public policy in general and an ultimate goal of government's economic policy in particular. So a tax policy should be evaluated on the basis of its consistency with the pace of economic growth which an economy targets to achieve. But unfortunately, over the past 4 decades, tax policy lost its soul, and its focus has shifted to a very narrow target of collecting revenues for government. In this regard, the evaluation criteria of a good tax policy has also changed, and now tax policy is looked at in terms of generating sufficient revenues to run a sustainable fiscal deficit. Most importantly, the benefits of collected revenues are not even compared with the cost that the tax policy generates through its distortionary effects on economic activity. These costs must be outweighed by benefits of public services. Otherwise, the net effect of government's footprint on the economy would be negative. So, keeping in mind the growth tax nexus, we have a very simple question for this webinar. Single question. Is tax policy of Pakistan consistent with the pace of economic growth that is needed to create opportunities for all? To answer this question, we have with us Dr. Mehmood Khalid, who is working as Senior Research Economist at PIDE, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Dr. Khalid has more than a decade-long experience of working on Pakistan's fiscal policy. He also teaches courses on public finance and fiscal policy. So he is the most relevant person to communicate with students on tax policy. Dr. Khalid, we have almost 40 students here in the hall who are attending your webinar, who are here to listen to you, and then almost 40 students will join online. Over to you, Dr. Khalid.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wasim. It's always a pleasure to be with you in a session. And since the University of Peshawar is also host many of our colleagues, ex-friends, so it will be always my pleasure to give a talk on a topic which we at PIDE have been actively working, and we feel that if change can come, then these are the sort of small issues, if we can tackle from the economic perspective, then it can help.
Khalid, you are not audible. We can't hear you.
Hello? Can you listen me? I'm sorry, I lost my internet for some time.
Okay. Now you are audible.
Okay, thank you. So
Voice is clear.
okay. So now before we start discussing that what are the loopholes on the part of the tax policy, let me admit here that FDR, like the other government institutions, is not very independent in terms of making its policy. There is an ongoing debate in terms of basically making two parts of the revenue division, where one should solely look into what should be the tax policy, and the second basically would look into the administrative or the implementation side of it. For the time being, it's basically both where the policy and the implementation are taken together. So maybe that is one of the reasons where the problems actually propel, because the targets are given, and in order to pursue these targets, the FDR had to comply with many issues which otherwise may not be suitable in the context of a good tax policy. So that debate is still going on, where we are going to see major shifts from the FDR towards the Ministry of Finance, where the Ministry of Finance is going to be the sole bearer in terms of making the policy decisions and other choices in terms of how the things should happen. So in that context, if you understand the tax outcomes, then one has to think through that, is it the FPR which should be declared as the faulty actor in this space, or is it basically the overall system of our revenue collection which needs a thorough redo or a makeover? I'm saying this because now we have got sufficient experience from the field visits and others, in which we have seen that the FPR officials are not at liberty in terms of policies. Often they make certain policies which are taken back through the Ministry of Finance or the cabinet, where the most likely impact should have been economic, or it should bear certain results, but it was not administered as per the FDR was thinking through. So it's high time that we need to separate these two routes, in which the tax policy is actually done by the finance division or some other entity which is into the whole affair of setting up the overall tax structure, and the FDR should be focused only on the collection side of it and thinking in terms of what are the administrative and other issues. But for the time being, they are basically confused in terms of making policies as well, and then thinking in terms of how these would be implemented. So what we see as a result is that their more focus is on the implementation side. So as I said earlier, they set out targets and they frantically move into the field in terms of making efforts for collecting. And in so doing so, they forget about the principles of a good tax policy. So primarily, it is apparently the FPR, but at the back of it, it's the whole structure or design of the revenue collection system in Pakistan, which needs a makeover and think through in terms of how. Now, at this backdrop, we did.
Doctor, kindly share your presentation, please.
Just. So, in that backdrop, we did a small report in terms of looking into how the tax collection is actually done, and rethink about the collection mechanism from a policy perspective. And we came out with about 9 sort of proposals, in which some of them were also adopted by the FPR in the subsequent budget. But the reason to identify this here in this academic forum is that these are the sorts of debates which we need to have in our academic sections as well, where all types of our research efforts in terms of the tax policy or the public finance should look into issues which are happening on ground and try to come out with some solid evidence-based research which can help in terms of improving the health. Now, as I said earlier, the FPR also needs our support. Often what is missed is that we also blame them where we know that it's not their sole reason or cause. So we need to develop a support from the academic circles in terms of how things can be improved. And that message basically FPR can take over in terms of the policy circles and adopt it. So I would basically start off with saying that it's basically the tax policy problem which one needs to think through in the whole of this discussion. Only thinking that the FPR is the main culprit in the system may be something which is too obvious, and we should refrain from such types of discussion which we often see in many forums as well. But for the time being, we will focus in terms of how a good tax policy should be carried out. So since it's an academic forum, and as we have mentioned that your research students are also participating in this webinar, so the first thing I would like to request them is that please note whatever concerns or questions they come out with, and if they can share their thoughts or ask questions at the end of my discussion. So I'll try to learn from them as well as respond wherever I can contribute in terms of some knowledge which I have from the experience which I have just mentioned of the last couple of years. So let me turn to my outline of the presentation, which may look very lengthy, but it's a very small presentation when we go forward. As I said that we wanted to work in terms of bringing out or proposing certain reforms which can improve the way taxes are being collected. And the idea was that they also take into account the growth perspective. As we have just mentioned that unfortunately the FBR perspective, and it should be, is to collect revenue. And when you ask them as well, they simply respond that this is our job, then we need to collect taxes. But what they forget is that way they are collecting taxes needs to be a little bit tinkered towards such an environment where the growth is not there. Now, as all of us sitting here are economists, so we would understand, and you have also mentioned that the taxes creates distortion in the system. Ideally speaking, the efficient resource allocation should happen where there are no public sector at all. The market should work in terms of allocating the resources, and they are well positioned in terms of doing that, identifying those resources which has the highest value to the society, as well as those are the most efficient in terms of the production. So the system should work on them. What we know as a student of economics and public sector economics is that there are government expenditures which needs to be financed, because these public goods provisioning needs to have some resource financing from within the system in order to provide for those goods and services which the government are to provide. So having said that, the taxation is basically kind of a charge of the government. This is their right where they can ask for their share from an activity without taking into account whether that activity has actually been benefited from the system or not. So that leads to the common problems which all of us know that, and it's normal that the interest of the individuals would be to avoid paying taxes as much as possible, because everybody likes to free ride. They would like to enjoy more services, and they would like to pay less taxes as much as possible. Simply saying that there should be tax culture and we should encourage everybody to pay taxes, that model does not work very well if you look around the world. It's very difficult in order to ascertain because there is no counterpart services which are coming. So we worked on this perspective that given FPR practice of tax collection, how we can improve it by small changes which are doable. Remember, in a public policy context, thinking about goals which are very
वो
good
कह रहे हैं
but
कि
are unachievable
दूसरे स्टूडेंट से बोला
should
सर
not
ना
be the
नोट्स इसके करें आप
choice for
क्वेश्चंस पूछें
policy prescription. As
आपने क्या
we know the concept of second best. So what we have seen is that first best solution often does not exist. So one has to think about the second best
ये
solution
भी जो
to
बोल
be
रहे हैं
the actual
ये
solution
या ये
for
दूसरे
any
वाले
ये जो
ongoing
बोल रहे
issue
हैं
or problem that we
इनका ध्यान है
are facing at hand. So we come out with certain recommendations which
बाद में
I'll
सुन लेंगे
go through in a bit
कैसे
detail
कैसे
just to
पूछेंगे
give you the background that from where
कैसे
we
कैसे पूछेंगे
अपने टीचर से
identified these
इनसे
issues,
नहीं
and at the end we are going to conclude
आपसे
basically
प्रेजेंटेशन
that
शेयर करें
the Pakistan's economy is not very unique, often which is criticized for even up to the level of our premier, which they say that we should not pay taxes, which is contrary to the actual payments made by the individuals across the country, where everybody is paying tax. It's not something which needs a rocket science. That the issue is of other nature, which basically PM and the other policy makers want to highlight that the taxation system is not uh, good enough to cater for the requirements for the fiscal spending. So prima facie, maybe one solution is to curb the expenditures rather than forcing too much on the taxation policy, because as a low-hanging fruit principles, let's do something which we can do more easily and quickly rather than thinking about something which may not happen in the years to come. So as I said earlier, the tax policy for the time being is basically set out as a residual. If you go into the expenditure setting mechanism for the budget side, what happens is that the expenditures are set first. Let's say they say that we are going to spend 100 rupees. Then they think about that what is going to be the likely sources of financing. For example, if we look at our debt generating capacity, for example, coming from the fiscal responsibility debt limitation law, then we look at the international donors commitments and others, then this gap of financing, which is basically government expenditures minus the available resources coming from the loan side, that is the tax to GDP or the tax target which is often set. So once you set that in a perspective of a residual element, that is always something which is a daunting task. And as we have discussed earlier, that often the um, uh, FPR in general is also criticized, and the overall nation that we don't pay taxes. So they would always set out a tax to GDP or overall taxation target to be very high, something which is almost impossible. And we should also think about it from a public policy perspective that moving to such higher taxation as it creates distortion is really going to affect the economic growth also. And what the policymakers do is that they leave the growth and employment towards the government intervention, primarily the PSDP funded projects, which is not happening for the time. So what we need to understand is that taxation policy also needs to be grounded in terms of certain principles which have been given to us by vast literature. It's not just Pakistan, it's everywhere. That the taxation system needs to be fair, it has to have certainty, it needs to be efficient, and it should be based on cost of collection or the convenience. But for the time being, what happens is that when you're setting targets too much, then the taxes being collected appears to be with a policy which is killing transactions rather than coming out with growth accommodating kinds of prescriptions. So what we see is that since the tax targets are set very elusive and there is no way that can be achieved, so that results into rethinking about the tax policy within a given fiscal year. Think about a business which is uh, uh, does does my slide change, or can you see my slides changing? Because I can see. Okay, so let me
Dr.
come
Khalid,
back.
Dr. Khalid, we are still on first slide.
Okay,
जो
so
आपका
let
टॉपिक
me.
है सो काइंडली इसको फुल स्क्रीन कर दें.
ठीक है. अब बेहतर नजर आ रही है, मतलब इंस्टेड ऑफ द प्रेजेंटेशन अब स्लाइड्स में रिमूव करके भी नजर आ रही है.
नहीं, अभी स्लाइड आ ही नहीं रही.
अब स्लाइड्स मेरी नहीं आती. लेट मी अगेन शेयर. और मैं पहले फुल स्क्रीन पे था, अब मैं एंटायर स्क्रीन करने लगा हूं, तो उसमें आपको मेरी जो प्रेजेंटेशन है वो एज इट इज नजर आ जाएगी. ठीक है ना? जस्ट लेट मी शेयर फुल स्क्रीन. और अब आप लोगों को मेरी प्रेजेंटेशन नजर आ रही है?
जी, प्रेजेंटेशन नजर आ रही है, लेकिन ये फुल स्क्रीन नहीं है.
इसको फुल स्क्रीन कर दूं अब? चले फिर मुझे बता दीजिएगा अगर वो चलना शुरू हो जाए तो उसके. ये सेकंड स्लाइड पे मैं.
जी, अब ठीक है.
So what happens is that if you think about from a business perspective, if you started off the business by assuming that the withholding tax on, let's say, a particular service contract was 4%, and suddenly during the fiscal year it turns out that it's going to be 5% or something like that, that literally destroys the way how the businesses should be done. So that creates a lot of uncertainty when the governments move into mini budgets within a given fiscal year. 1 year is even not enough for a good policy for the businesses to focus on as the backdrop. Often the policies of good economies have the medium-term fiscal frameworks, which basically lays out the possible taxes and other changes for a 5-year, 10-year perspective. But what we see here is that even a given year is actually not focused, and within a year we would see many things changing. So that creates a lot of uncertainty in terms of how the businesses think about our tax policy and think about the production or a growth context that our actors which needs to transact more and more are basically apprehensive that if they start investing in a particular sector, suddenly the regime is going to change. So what would happen next? So basically become further the documentation, so-called documentation, or the drive towards making the economy formal is too much. And that creates such a compliance cost that the businesses start thinking about that what's my compliance cost versus tax evasion and tax avoidance. So they come out with equilibrium solution at the end of the day, which results into actually not paying taxes and investing in avoiding or hiding the transaction. Because as a business, they are going to think about making profit. So they are going to think about the best ways. And often what we see from the field note is that the businesses generally have a behavioral change in terms of how they do things. And that is fair enough, because at the end of the day, they're going to think about what is my maximum profit at which I can do business. So what we estimated that on average, the businesses have to pay about 250,000 for the compliance in administration. Besides the taxation which they have to bear as a cost, they have to deploy about resources of about 250,000, which includes the premise cost, which includes hiring of an accountant, which includes the stationery charges, which includes a setup in terms of the internet and other equipment, which needs to be there in order to do all that documentation part of the taxation of the client. So that is something which really pushed us in terms of understanding that why is it there and how we can improve. Further, there are issues in terms of policies which are totally out of date. For example, the tariff policy. Now that tariff policy should be thinking about how the businesses can improve. But for the time being, the objective is to collect revenue. So the customs is basically as a revenue instrument or a revenue handle, rather than thinking about the custom as a tool for tariff policy. So what it results is that we have such higher rates of tariffs that
Daujam
it basically kills the
इसके साथ
whole
भी
goal
इसकी
of
लिखी
good open economy where the goods and services can freely move into and out of the system in order to produce goods and services which are efficient. So we would find that the things are coming into our system from
इसकी भी
great channels
500
such as the uh, smuggling and other
जी
issues which we
नहीं
are going to
ये
discuss
वाई
later
के
on. So overall, what happens is that we saw that
साथ
the
स्कूल में
tax
है
rates are higher if you compare from the neighboring countries. For example, even look at the general sales tax, 17%
उसकी
versus
भी
maybe
लिखी वही
in other countries it is set at a lower rate with a broader base. And the
वासिफुल्ला
bases are very narrow as because literally, as I said earlier, that the businesses try to hide
वासिफुल्ला
and they have the provisions to do that as well. Then there are differential treatments, and I'll talk about that in a little detail when we go
जीपीएस है
forward. And finally, the
जी जी
exemption. This is the irony of the
राशा
system.
बशीर
That on the one hand, we are saying and we are
राशा
suggesting that
बोलिए
nobody pays taxes, nobody pays taxes. But if you look at the volume of the exemptions which have been given, which are
मलिक
generally
आसिफ
reported in the document called as the tax
500
expenditures. And remember, these are over and above the subsidies which are provided. Subsidies is a different subject. Tax expenditures are
मलिक
those
आसिफ
exemptions which are given within the taxation
हाँ
structure.
ये भी
So
जीपीएस
think
है
about a business
अभी
which
सारे
can
जीपीएस चल रहे हैं
lobby
ये भी
or
500
create some kind of an evidence where they
हलीमा
predict that
ये
if
हमारा
you
शवकी
give them exemption, this is the welfare gain
अगर नदे
versus
फाजा
paying taxes. So they are going to invest more resources in terms of getting themselves that
हमायूं
exemption. So that all leads to an outcome which is basically pushing the businesses into an arena which is not very growth friendly and it is something which
हमायूं ने
is
भी
emerging from taxation.
500 दिए
This is something which we really want to fight. Boyd estimated in a study by one of our colleagues here, Dr. Mehmood Khalid, that almost 45% of the business firms are zombie firms in Pakistan. Now, the concept of the zombie firm is basically, it has originated from the finance literature,
आदित जान
where basically it says that a
के
firm
आप
is
आमना लिखे
not viable to run,
ये
but
आमना
since
के
there
देवर
are loans and
हाँ
credits
आमना के देवर
which has
है
been
केरा
given to that
आमना
firm, so the bank basically would show it as an
रन
ongoing
तो दो
concern and they would keep on financing on an assumption that things might turn around in the future. It's like a Ponzi game which the banks are running with the firms. But the firms are actually non-viable as per the documentation. Now, I'm not suggesting or saying that these firms are actually not viable. Maybe they are running on a parallel system. But what the system tells us that it's a non-viable firm because it is running into a negative territory or a negative profit for quite some time. So that is basically what we see
हाँ
mainly emerging
अतावल्ला
from
वीनस होटल
taxation side because when you are declaring your income tax
सर
returns
होटल लेके
in
बस
negative zone, that is an indicator that your businesses are
होटल
not doing well. And why are they doing it? That's of
इनका
course
होटल है
what
ना
we need to avoid
हाँ
as much as
जी
we can.
हाँ 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 बशीर
So
हाँ
that leads us to a kind of a situation where the
500
businesses, 25% of our businesses are there in the system which are actually doing nothing,
हाँ
but they are taking away lots and lots of credits and exemptions from the system. So this is basically a direct loss of the potential taxes which the firms basically should be contributing, but
अब्दुल
they're
वकील
not doing it because it's the policy which is making them declare that. So the obvious outcome should be that a zombie
अब्दुल
fund should be
वकील
closed if it is a
इसके
true
साथ लिखे
non-performing,
बदू
or the tax rate should be lowered so that they can come out and actually play a role in terms of providing
1000
for the economic growth. Now, I'm not going to go into too much of the growth diagnostics, but
दूसरा
as a
है
student of
करीम
economics, all of us know that Pakistan's growth
करीम
is a conundrum.
हाजी साहब
We
इनके
really
साथ
don't understand that we are doing very good and certainly we start to go down.
ये
Although
500
this graph is basically of the most recent one, where we see that the
लेकिन
economic growth has plunged because of
जब
COVID, but it's the same story historically. Although it didn't go into the negative, but the
हाँ
short
अगर
cycles are followed.
हाँ
the
मोहम्मद
growth
हनीफ
momentum is going to
ये
take place for
फ्रेंड
2 years, then it's going to fall, then it's again, which is very unable to digest
2000
from an economic perspective. That it's simply saying that how is it possible that the businesses are working very fine for one given year, and
हाँ
then
ये
next
मेरा
year
जूनियर है
they start thinking
एमफिल का
that sorry,
स्टूडेंट
this
है
is too much and we have to cut it down.
हाँ
There is
उसका
something
लेकिन
going
जवाद
on in the
रहीम
system,
अफरीदी
and we
ये
believe
अभी फ्रेंड
that
शुरू हो
tax
गया
policy is one of the main reasons which is
जवाद
not
रहीम
helping out
अफरीदी
in this.
जैसा
Our
जवाद
taxation
अफरीदी
system should
लिखी
be elastic enough to provide for the sources as well the room as
इसकी भी
well as
2000
take
है
back what they are providing in
जी
the bad situation.
हाँ
So
अभी ये जिसका लिखा
we
हुआ
are
कोड है
we
ना
alone in this
ये
discussion or debate?
18 ग्रेड
No,
में है
why it
और
is not true. And this is
क्लास फेलो
something
भी है तो
which has been
इसका चेक
mentioned
करते
by
हैं क्या
many
निकलता है
other renowned economists of Pakistan. For example, Hafiz Pasha, everybody knows. They have been suggesting that
इसकी भी
the
2000
it is the
इसका
oppressive tax
हसीबुल्ला
burden which is keeping the growth low.
हसीबुल्ला इसके साथ यूओपी लिखिए
Often
यूनिवर्सिटी
the
ऑफ
word of
पेशावर
mouth from such big names is enough as an evidence. Mozema, Bukhari, and Ikramul Haq have talked about
हाँ
the complexity of the tax system and the need to develop or shift to a simple
ये
system where the
देखिए
rates are flat and the revenue collection is done by single
हाँ
agency. Dr. Manzoor Ahmed, K.R. Kamal, they
शेदा
have been
मोहम्मद
talking about rationalization of the protection policy,
शेदा एस
which
एच
is
ए आई डी एन
where you are creating
आई डी
differences
ए
in terms of the
मोहम्मद
taxation or differentiating between two entities on the premise that
इस्लाम
one
भाई
needs more
सर
protection. Within five, Dr.
500
Nasser has worked that
Danish
the
sir तो
consumer welfare is missing
Danish sir
from the total tariff-based protection regime. Similarly, other
शाहिद
works
अली
have
रजा
been cited. For example, Dr. Nadeemul Haq has come out
आर
with
ए डबल
a
जे ए
notion
आर
that the sustainable and accelerated
शाहिद
growth
अली रजा
should come from the market forces. And that is going to result into an increase and sustainable revenue, which otherwise
इसके
is being kept as
1000
market. So having said that, as I mentioned earlier, that FPR's performance is not too bad. So if you look at the revenue collection scheme which they have been able
दो
to
तीन ही
manage
रहते
in
हैं
the last
इसके
decades,
बाद
it has
लेके
been phenomenal. We have
इमदाद
moved
अली
from
शाह
1 trillion to almost 5 trillion last year.
हाँ
This year
और एक
is
आया
almost
मैं
close to 6 trillion. But the main problem is when, as it is said, that it's the details are in the devil.
इमदाद अली
If you
शाह
go
1000
deeper into this collection of the taxes, then you would find out infections in the system. And that is something which we have seen it. Although some of it is because of the rebasing, but it appears that
आसिम खान
despite all the efforts, despite making large
आईबी
claims and all of the things, our
इंटेलिजेंस
tax
ब्यूरो
collection as a percentage of total
इसके
economic
500
activity is
लिखी
going down. So think about it that our tax policy managers or the ones
फिर
which are
लिखी
implementing have been
असदुल्ला
claiming that we are doing this, we are doing that, everybody's in tax sheet, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, what we
बाबा खलील
look at
लिखी
is that as a
BABHACL
percentage of the overall reported income, our collection is actually going down instead of stabilizing at 20%. So the rebasing of the GDP has basically identified that in the last
असदुल्ला
year
बाबा खिल
we have actually
1000
collected not more than 8% of the GDP, which otherwise was planned at
बस
12 or even higher
इसके एक
percentage
पिक्चर
of
लेके मुझे सेंड कर दें
overall economy. Now, as a student of economics, we should be clear that in Pakistan we have a different or a parallel structure of revenue collection.
स्क्रीनशॉट
One for the
लेके
federal government and the second for the provincial government. The FPR is responsible for the collection of taxes at the federal government level, although its
राजा वो
jurisdiction holds the
चाय
whole
रेडी है
Pakistan. Then
किचन
we
में
have the provincial revenue authorities, which is collecting taxes from the provinces. The FPR is almost collecting
वहाँ में आज था
a major side, close to 8, and earlier GDP basis it was about 10%, and the remaining 3 to 4% is a collection of other than FPR taxes as well as the provincial revenue authorities, which is very small. So the first proposal which we come out with by looking at the existing tax structure was that the withholding tax regime needs to be orient our colleagues here that the withholding tax regime means that the job of tax collection is being done by somebody other than FPR, and they basically collect the taxes on behalf of the FPR and then transfer it back to the FPR. For example, the salaried persons, their income tax is deducted by the employer and transmitted to the FPR. If some of you is paying fees on self-financing basis in your university, they would know that there is an element of withholding taxes on educational services, and the university in this case is collecting taxes on behalf of the FPR and remitting to the FPR. What is the problem in this? The problem is two sorts. One, if you are charging withholding tax other than pure income, which is the salary, which is the dividend, which is the profit, or which is the capital gains, and you are moving into the territory of collecting taxes which is on the transaction, that really kills the economic activity because it acts like an indirect tax. Say for example, your university basically hires the services of a contractor to build roads in the university. Now what the FPR's instruction is that above a particular threshold of an amount, you have to withhold the tax as an income tax. Now the contractor is not going to adjust that in the income tax return which he may be or may not be filing. So end of the day, it works like an indirect. So what has happened over time is that because it's an easier way to collect taxes, our direct tax collection regime is shifting towards this. So we find that almost 70% of our resources, which we so call the direct taxes, are based on the withholding tax regime. And the direct, or what we call as the voluntary payments, have been reduced almost to 25 to 30% of the total tax collected. So that is something which is very worrisome. So what does that mean? That we have to think through. We have to understand that what is wrong in this withholding tax regime. So it needs to be reduced first of all. There has to be a limit. We should not go over and above a particular level. Like for example, if the total income tax collected is 1.5 trillion and almost 1.2 trillion is coming out of the withholding tax regime, that's not fair for an economy which needs growth. So we need to reduce. And for those withholding which are generally based on income, that also needs a good refund or an adjustment process. Because what happens is that at the end of the day, most of the people think about that tax as a final liability and they don't get it adjusted. And that is something which basically one needs to think through, because it is actually not withholding which is adjustable. It is withholding which is non-adjustable. So it has to be made similar to the system which is provided for the exporters, which is called the faster in terms of the refunds system. So we also need to reduce the withholding tax lines on the transactions, as I've just mentioned, the contracts, the services, even the educational institutions. Why should a person pay on the educational fees as an income tax, which is a proxy of the income tax? We should charge the income tax on the source, because that is giving a kind of an indication that, okay, please don't tell us your income, simply pay this much tax on XYZ. Whether you're paying more or less, that's not an issue, we're good. So that is purely revenue collecting or revenue enhancement idea, but not a fair tax policy. And we need to incentivize withholding agents as well, because as we mentioned earlier, the compliance cost is too high. So what the university is going to do, they're going to collect on behalf of the FPR, then they have to in a more documented manner, they have to inform the FPR, they have to basically surrender that amount on an every quarterly basis. This is too much for a withholding. So they need to be incentivized. And whatever you have collected, you should have some information on it, and that should be basically made part of the return form. So if I purchase, let's say, a plot, that plot in terms of the value of the purchase and the tax collected should come in my tax return, so that it is adjusted fair and simple. So that basically led us to another query that let's look into the tax lines. How many of them are basically very good? There is a term called as the revenue spinners in the FPR jargon, which basically looks into what are the tax lines which are most buoyant or giving us resources. We went opposite to that. And we tried to ascertain that how many of the tax lines are actually not contributing too much. So the simple theory was that to look into the tax lines which are collectively not generating more than 1% of the revenue. For example, if it is 1.5 trillion on the direct taxes side, so let's look at the tax lines which are contributing less than 1%. So from a 1.5 trillion perspective, it's going to be 115 billion, not more than 15 billion. So you would be amazed that in the withholding income tax regime, there were 35 tax lines out of almost 82, 85, which were contributing less than the 1%, almost 9.22 billion out of 1.34 trillion rupees. So think about a system in which more than half or almost half of the tax lines are generating just peanuts, 9 billion out of 1.34 trillion. This situation is even more worse in case of the sales tax. Almost 596 tax lines out of 821 were contributing not more than 7 billion out of almost 1 trillion rupees. So this is peanuts. Even if you simply stop collecting this 7 billion, that's not going to make a major change. However, businesses are going to be relieved from an excessive documentation and trying to hide and trying to avoid this. So what we did was that we did a small calculation that what if that total of 32 billion overall is not collected and the savings in terms of compliance cost for the firms, which we mentioned earlier, almost 250,000 rupees per year, is basically a saving to the firms which they can reinvest into the business. So that would have basically created a multiplier income of about 109 billion, and the FPR collection would have been more than what they have actually stopped collecting from these revenue non-spinners. So we suggested a complete list of the revenue non-spinners which should be simply taken away from the system, and some of them were actually picked up by the FPR as well, and you might have seen it in the Finance Bill 2020 that they have basically taken away some portion. But it was not based on the principle of the revenue non-spinners. It had other contexts also which were there. Similarly, we basically looked into the compliance cost or the cost of the documentation. And for that, since we didn't have a benchmark survey, so we used the cost of doing business survey of the World Bank, and it turned out that Pakistan is very poor in terms of how the business of collecting taxes is done. Just look at the time to comply with corporate income tax correction. Bangladesh 37 hours, Pakistan takes 68 hours for a firm's person to go to the FPR and get something corrected, which is because of the FPR itself from the very first. Remember, whenever we have a situation where there is a friction, that means the system is at fault. It's not the person which is in problem. It's the law. There is some provision which needs to be made. So what we suggested is that we need to improve the system overall. Why should the FPR focus on too much of a documentation and not invest in third party? So the FPR needs to develop its data mining capacity. It should integrate where the information would be available to them rather than asking the firms to come out with all sorts of documentation rather. What overall documentation is basically about is not for the documentation itself. What the FPR thinks is that if the tax returns are too much documented, it's going to help them bring out more taxes. But has it been very fruitful? I've given you a picture. It has not been. So what comes out is that the registration system is very cumbersome. The taxes and details of the transactions have to be provided on monthly and quarterly basis. The businesses should stop doing the business and they should only think about making the documentation or the compliance. The withholding agents are in double jeopardy, so they have to document their transactions as well as the individuals or the firms or associations or persons from which they have collected the withholding tax on the behalf of the FPR. So just think about it that the university is collecting the withholding tax in the educational fees, and FBR is asking them to keep a record of all the details for the individuals whose withholding taxes they have collected. So wouldn't it create some hazards in terms of their doing business? That is something which has to be improved upon, because is the additional information leading to any improvement in the system? Does it lead to increase in the risk of audits or something like that? No, it is only predatory and it is not helping the system. So the businesses move towards the options of evading or avoiding. And by the way, our judicial system is also something which one has to really think about, because instead of facilitating, they are always a hurdle. And especially in case of the taxation challenges, let's say in the field of the track and trace system, they have been most puzzling thing for the FPR to come out. So this is the same which we estimated that the business compliance cost is too high. Now the problem with this compliance cost is that it's not size specific. For example, if there is a small shop which is tax liability is just, let's say, 100,000 per annum, the compliance cost would be the same. And if a firm has a liability of 2 billion per year, the compliance cost would still be the same, because the frequency of the return filing, the number of the documents, the other compliance requirements are the same. It is not specific to the size of the business. So what the FPR really needs to do is to improve or simplify the filing requirement. And the compliance burden can be reduced by improving the frequency and details in that filing. I bet if some of you is filing their income tax return, they themselves would not understand that what are the blocks are about, and the FPR person also never use them. So the information which is being collected is redundant, it's not used. Then there is a debate going on in terms of the filer, non-filer, and some of you might have also witnessed it. You go for a car registration, they're going to say that, sorry, you are a filer, so you have to pay this much, and you are a non-filer, you have to pay this much. This non-filing option or the premium itself creates an opportunity or incentives for individuals not to file. Whereas the objective should have been simply asking for filing. If you think that a particular transaction is reflecting a size of the income which needs an income tax. For example, if a person is buying a 4 million car, he should file. Why should you ask him or her that you pay this much prime on non-filing and you can go? Because that is the incentive with the FPR. On top of that, once you have created a withholding tax, so that itself should be enough that the people should be motivated to file a return. Rather than creating this wedge in filing and non-filing, a single rate would have been enough. You go to the counter of registration, they say that this is the withholding rate. You pay that withholding. If you want to file, you will be able to adjust it. If you don't file, then you will bear that cost. So why this distinction of filer, non-filer, we really don't understand. So it should be mandatory, where you think that this is a transaction which needs to, which warrants a particular level of the income or economic activity which needs to come under the taxation rate. Then there are differentiation in terms of the different tax bases, which is against the principle of their taxation. The equity principle of the taxation says that same should be taxed in the same manner. But what we see is that agricultural income is not there. Whereas the income, whether it's coming from the agriculture or coming from industry or whatever business, is income. So the income should be taxed. But since most of our legislative are belonging to this category, so often it is not considered part of the system. Now, this is not just the tax coming from the income side, it creates multiple problems also, because that's a complete sector. This is almost 20-21% of our GDP, which is not taxed. So from that perspective, we are leaving so big a sector not to come in your base, and that creates a friction in the system. Now, how would you classify that this is agriculture, this is not agriculture? A business, let's say dairy farm, let's say something which is pertaining to the farm in some sense, how would you classify whether it's agriculture? Then there are presumptive regimes. Presumptive means that the FPR thinks that this is your tax liability and it's fixed in mind. Whereas the other way around, the corporate sectors have minimum tax on the turnover. Instead of looking into their actual incomes, the FPR has basically agreed on a formula that instead of the annual income tax returns, based on your actual activity, you simply pay us 1% of the total sales, and that would be good enough. But that's a discrimination in terms of the tax code. So one has to be very clear that what's the actual income tax rate at the end of the day, because that is going to set lines for the businesses and create a fairness in the system. Then there are, as I mentioned earlier, different revenue collecting agencies as well. For example, the provincial revenue authority, they are charging their general sales tax on services separately as compared to the federal general sales tax on goods. So that creates duplicity in terms of the mandates for return filing and the compliance costs. And there are differences in terms of the rates as well. Although this is not bad from a fiscal jurisdiction perspective, that the provinces are trying to compete with each other in terms of attracting the businesses. But often what happens is that creates more complications in the system rather than facilitation. So there is a fragmented base, and the segmentation between the goods and services basically makes the system more complex. So it has to be harmonized, which is done at least for the returns filing for the time being with the help of the sales tax national registry, where you just have to file the return once. But the rates differences and the mechanism through which the revenue is going to be shared is yet not known, how that they are going to come out with the formula for that. Then if you look at the overall tax code, that's too complex. For example, the World Bank's ranking in 2020 in terms of the overall paying tax report says that the system is very complex with a higher compliance cost. Now remember, paying tax is something different, but the way it is being collected is too difficult for a common person to understand. I bet, again, I say that you're saying that everybody should be filing a return. Take the current system of filing return. Look at the form and you take it to a person who is a common person, who doesn't have time, who doesn't understand the law, who doesn't understand the English too much, he doesn't know about the tax credits, he doesn't know about the liabilities and exemptions which they can charge to the overall, and then you expect them to file it up. That's almost impossible. So what happens at the end of the day, for example, if you look at the Federal Tax Ombudsman report, 66% of the complaints or the cases which were registered against the FPR were accepted. What does that mean? That the FPR system is complex and it has provisions of getting away. So 66% is more than 50%. The statutes and regulation of the FPR are provided in almost 34 documents besides the clarification and notification. It has 15 acts, 11 ordinances, and 8 rules. So think about yourself as a tax-paying, tax-abiding citizen of Pakistan who has to read 634 pages of pure legal language in order to be called as a tax-compliant income tax return filing person of Pakistan. I cannot do it. I really don't about the sales tax, they have to think about the public excise duty, they have to think about the um, licensing regime and so many other things. Think about a business which might have to go around about 7,000 pages of pure legal documents in order to call themselves as compliant business. So what needs to be done is that the whole tax codes needs to be rewritten. This is what we call as, in terms of the public finance, as zero base revision, where we start from the scratch. We think about that, what is the need of this particular clause, what is the need of this particular statement, what is the need of this, what is the need of that, and then try to simplify as much as possible, delete all the unnecessary clauses and compliance requirements, because that is going to help us improve the tax compliance. And the overall language of the tax code should be very reader friendly and easy for compliance. That helps the overall system, because you would not have certain refunds and, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of complaints against the FD. And that is going to help in terms of improving the statistics which come out from the arbitration forums such as the Federal Tax Court. So what we see is that there were almost 1,681 complaints in 2009. Out and further maladministration 493, unnecessary notice 125. So the total was about 2,510. So think about it. If you have, let's say, a traffic crossing which is without signal, the people are going to get stuck because there is no clarity. And there is a system where there are red, green, and yellow lights working, or there is a policeman which is there. So the system can run smoothly and there is no friction with the system. But if it is your requirement to keep the system complex, then it's something different. But otherwise, the simple evidence says that it needs to improve. And we've talked about this refund system, that it needs to improve because it is for the time being not very efficient. Just think about it, that our Prime Minister comes on media screen and gives back the refunds claim as an incentive or a subsidy, whereas the businesses are saying that, come on, this is our own money which was stuck in the FPR for so long. FPR is paying back them their own money. Had they invested that 50 billion in some project, they would have earned 1 or 2 billion more. The FPR is paying them back their own money, and they're doing it on media, claiming that they're giving incentives, they're giving a subsidy to the system, which is totally new. And on top of that, we see that there are exemptions in the system, there are concessions in the system, which we call as tax expenditure. The literature tells us that the governments think that instead of collecting and then spending, if they can simply let the agents not pay tax, that would be a kind of a tax expenditure for the welfare. But if somebody asks them that, please give us that statement or the estimation which you must have done in order to see that what's the welfare good. For example, if you give some exemption to, let's say, a trust or any entity, has there been any calculation that what's the corresponding benefit to the society? Because there is a concept of opportunity cost. If you look at the 2019-20 tax expenditure report, it says 1.3 trillion rupees has been lost from the system. So think about that 1.3 trillion and the size of, let's say, public sector development program. PSDP was at that time 500 billion. So you could have financed almost 3 equivalent size of public sector development programs had these exemptions not been given. So there should be some calculation in terms of looking into whether that exemption has actually contributed more than 3 times of the public sector development program job creation and growth or not. Simply stating that, oh look, we have given such and such exemptions for the welfare people is not enough. A good system would tell us in terms of measurable metrics that what is the exact outcome, what is the exact benefit to the society, so that we can compare it with the would have been 3% is now 5.5% of the GDP. So there is a cost which I have to bear for these exemptions. Are the benefits of these exemptions enough to outweigh the cost which I am bearing of not collection?
او دی یو ورځ میچول دی بیا دا کړو
Mechanism rather than thinking about evaluation. These are all based on SROs and schedules which are given to the system. Again, go
اما
back
دا
to
یو دا
the
یو
comment that I said that taxes has to be fair.
اما دا هیرو نه خدا خدا
If you're charging me 17%, you should charge another business with 17% as well. When you say that, sorry, for this business I'm going to charge a 5% as per the schedule, and for you I'm going to charge 17%. So that creates an anomaly, that creates a distortion, which is very damaging for the overall business environment. While you have other social welfare mechanisms working in the system as well. For example, the Benazir Income Support Program, a very big subsidy program as well. So why can't you pay those which really can't live without the exemption from that system and let the tax system run in a very simple manner? That has to be really seen into, and the context of the zero rated and exemptions should be taken away totally. Finally, there is a very major element in terms of how we engage with the rest of the world and how the world is doing. I'm sure most of you who are working on the taxation literature, there is a concept of BEPS, or the concept of a value chain which is going across the country. So there's a concept of made in the world. They have adopted such rules and procedures where tax avoidance because of transfer pricing is not possible. But in our case, that is something which we have undertaken. I'll give an example. A truck worth, let's say, 10 million starts its journey from Chinese factory to Pakistan. When it enters the Chinese port, the value is declared as 10 million, and they basically charge their customs and other departments. When the same truck lands in Pakistan, the value somehow appears to be 5 million rather than 10 million, because there is no counter data sharing arrangements between the ports of the two countries. Hence, the truck which is valued at 10 million in China is valued at 5 million in Pakistan, thereby taking away some of our dear resource which could have been collected. Similarly, the transfer pricing, where simply one firm says that sorry, you can't charge me income tax here because I pay my tax liabilities in some other country. Now, other economies have actually worked on it, and they have made mechanisms under which such types of transfer pricing are not possible. But in our case, that is something which is not. So overall, what we think is that our taxes are not investment taxes, and they are not promoting industrialization. And these need to be worked in terms of many areas which can actually help in terms of bringing in more investment. For example, the tax credits for the balancing and modernizing requirements of the business environment. Similarly, the depreciation allowance. Similarly, the use of the non-tax policies such as the export credits and others which are rolled out into the FDR. These are all which is basically not very business friendly. So overall, what we think about the tax to be GDP ratio, that it should be thought about in terms of the effective taxes, not the ones which are reported, and we should include the tax compliance cost, the tax expenditure costs, and all other costs in that system. And if you include all of them, then for example for 2019, instead of 9.9% of the FDR tax collected as a percentage, it turns out that it is going to be 14.23%. So we should report that instead of reporting a 9.9% of the GDP collected by the FDR, because actual impact of the tax liability is 14.2%, not the 9.9 which is there. But why is it so happening? Because we, the academicians, are not facilitating the end. There is very less research on tax policy and administration. We see theses which are coming out in terms of the direct taxes impact on the growth or the indirect taxes component or something like that, but it does not go deep into the tax policy, into the issues, and come out with proposals or suggestions which can really improve in terms of how the FPR should take away it, make its policy better. They're looking for research, but we are not helping them out. We are not providing them solutions. And remember, quiet alone cannot do it. We all, as an academic nation, as an academic entity of the nation, have to support them. We have to think about the ways through which they can improve the tax collection, to do the business of tax collection in a better manner. Because if we don't, then the revenue targets would be unrealistically set, because you can see now that the government expenditures are not going to come down. For whatever reason, that needs another webinar. But for the time being, they're not going to come down. So in order to meet those expenditures, the FPR has to increase its revenue collection. And that is going to be more challenging. And in the end, I'm simply going to say that stop calling us as tax. One is on our own responsibility that we have not been able to provide with the evidence-based. But if you look at the existing ways of collecting taxes, that is not reflecting a low tax payment by the society. Take for the example the lowest denominator, the mobile card of 500 rupees, but everybody is using it. It has now about 30% of the taxes which are collected to that card. So who can say that nobody is paying, because everybody is using the mobile. So what we suggest is that rather confronting the taxpayers as tax cheat, the FBR should think about facilitation, education, and building a better system, and work on the taxpayers' trust in order to improve the tax collection. Now I rest my case here. Thank you very much for your patient listening. And as Dr. Wasim Shahid Malik now will take over and guide us how we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehmood Khalid, for a very, very interesting and informative lecture. Of course, it will help a lot to our students, and I hope that they have learned a lot from your lecture. Now the floor is open for questions. Dr. Khalid, some of the questions are there in the chat. So if you can see those questions, then you may answer.
Okay. Let me see them one by one, and I'll try to answer, and I'll learn from some of them as well. As I said again, that maybe I'll not have answers to everybody. Let me see. The first question is from Muhammad Atif Saab, who says that data sharing issues, as FPR does not have easy access to the Nadra excise or bank data directly, as they request them to provide with, which makes times that should not FPR be provided with direct access to taxpayers' data available. It's a good comment, but the issue is that often there are data sharing protocols there. Now remember, if we provide access to each and every activity or transaction into the hands of the FPR, so if they are not competent enough and they are more predatory, maybe that's not going to help. So what we often suggest is that let's go one by one. For example, maybe the real-time data sharing is one possibility, but before that, the audits needs to pick up. They can say, for example, that they don't have enough posts. That's true. But why can't we hire, let's say, the auditors in bulk for, let's say, a 5-year project? So once everybody who is giving them tax returns or they are liable to give them returns should be scrutinized, so that there is a threat perception in the society that if they don't let the FPR know, they are going to be. But before even going to that, we need to improve the taxation structure, the rates which have. I totally agree with your suggestion that the real-time access should be there. As I've just mentioned, for example, if a person buying a car worth of 4.5, 4.0 billion, then automatically the SDR should put it in their tax return that, sir, you have purchased a car worth 4 million, and on the basis of our in-house data, we estimate that your income should be 10 times more than that, because otherwise you would not invest in a car worth of 4 million without having an income on an annual basis to be 10 times more. And they should be able to put up a good case. So you're right in that sense, but at times we cannot provide them 100% access on each and everything. That's going to be too much depth. Income tax on agriculture, again, as I suggested, yes, that's a fair point. And FBR chairman actually wrote a letter to the Provincial Revenue Authority that, look, we know that who is declaring their income to be coming from the agriculture, let us tax on your behalf and let us give you back your money, but the provincial authorities did not pay. You're very right in that. Okay, then we have that from after the last question. Sir, after 2001, in Pakistan, the tax system is self-assessment, and every person assesses his own income and evade the taxes. So if the FPR, that's what I'm saying, that we need to improve in terms of the audits. We are working on a thesis in FIDE where basically we have seen that even after the audits, there is no penalty. So just look at a system where the cost of cheating is the recovery of the taxes only. So what the FBR does is they're going to catch you and they're going to say, look, you have not paid us 200,000 worth of the tax. So I'll simply say that please take it because that is your money. So what is my benefit in it? If I'm not caught, then I am basically would make 200,000. If I get caught, my liability is the actual recovery, which otherwise I would have paid as a tax amount. So that is a dilemma of the system which needs to improve. You are very right in that. Okay, Atif again, the different tax agencies for collecting sales tax and charging, that is what I've also mentioned, that it has to be uniform and harmonized system. Dishan Saab says, okay, right. Atif, again, as you suggested, tax credits and further exemptions, different industries, increasing initial announced 50% of the half-year discretion, will it not further reduce revenue? No. The issue is that when we are providing them the depreciation and other adjustments, it's basically to facilitate the investment. So think about it as an economist. Okay, what happens if the businesses reinvest in their own business? They don't consume, they don't take it away as an income. So the total worth of the business goes up and they can basically start producing more and more economic activity, which for future is going to give us more resources. So when we are making certain changes, maybe the initial impact is not going to be that good, but in the long run, that is going to be more beneficial to us. Saeed Ahmed Saab says that, sir, how we increase tax collection by making more research of the tax? That is $1 million question. And for that, we have to actually we have to brainstorm. Normally, when we are addressing a particular policy question at FIDE, what we do as a practice is that we sit together. We first of all understand the mechanism and think about the whole process of the value chain. Then we come out with certain strategies and their possible responses. So I'll give you an example. You guys are near to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Revenue Authority. Go and talk to them. Tell them that you have got a very good research force here. Please share with us some of your policy concerns which needs evidence. Yes, for example, they collect taxes on services and let's say they have a problem of compliance. Nobody is basically filing return. Go into the field, ask the person what is holding you from this. They're going to tell you that it's too much cumbersome, it takes time, it's very complicated. And instead of that, if we can have this system, we would be much better. The evidence is required for good policy. The CAPRA itself cannot do this job. So you have to be there as a helping hand for them to understand the system and then they have to basically come out with the outcome. The deferred tax liabilities are basically the liabilities which has accrued but are not matured. I'll give an example. If you buy a plot and
Sama
there
siya
is
ang
a
class din eh.
tax department, the time the time when you come to resale for that, then all the tax liabilities which have accrued are going to be adjusted. So the liability is occurred, but it is deferred till a certain point in time. So that's a kind of a relief to the businesses which is provided. Again, Arthur Saab, sir, as you said that FPR should focus on revenue collection instead of policy making revenue target. Can we ignore the FPR in policy making? We would not ignore them. Definitely they are going to provide us with the information, with the experience or the knowledge which they are going to give. But the overall policy has to be from the ones which are custodians of economic growth, of the economic welfare. Because if you only leave it for the FPR, they're going to at the end of the day say that look, we have got you a golden egg, and they're going to forget about the chicken which is going to die, which is basically there for collecting that golden egg. So the policy has to be made by
How much is one?
and implementation has to be done.
Ala, wale, Rasha, Rasha.
Saab says that can you please explain again spinners? Spinner, that's a terminology which the FDR uses to identify most revenue paying sectors. Like for example, if you look at the sales tax, there are about I think 8 out of this list of 9 sectors which is paying almost 60 to 70% of the sales. So God forbid those 8 sectors if they have some problem, such as let's say energy, if there is an energy shortfall and one of that sector is not performing well, then total revenue collection stream is going to die up. So what we did was the opposite. Instead of looking at the ones which are giving them most revenue, we looked at the ones which are actually giving them peanuts. And we are suggesting to simply treat them as we do in terms of regression. We call them as an insignificant value. So we are simply asking them to take it, and that's going to help in terms of improving the system. Qasim Saab says that only salary class give taxes, but the traders report to the non, which creates distortion. They evade taxes in one form. That's true. But the issue is that who's going to think about improving the system? We are not different from the rest of the world. There they also have traders and others. And I bet it's not a matter of trust always. The system has to be good enough in terms of identifying. For example, track and trace. They have just recently implemented the track and trace system in the sugar sector, and that has led to increase in the revenue by many folds. There is provision in the law which basically allows the FDR to establish track and trace systems wherever they want. So simply acting upon something which is in the law can help in terms of the tax collection from other sectors as well. Saeed Ahmed Saab asked that, sir, how we remove the tax exemptions on large scale businesses. I'm not suggesting that we should simply take it away. I'm suggesting that there should be some way of learning that is the impact there or not. And secondly, there should be some sunset clause. We cannot give exemptions for life. That's against the unfair, that's against the fair treatment principle of taxation, where certain sectors of the economy are paying and certain other sectors are exempted for the rest of their lives. For example, automobile sector, if they still claim that they are infant, for the last 60 years they have not been able to grow the market. We should let them be part of the regular taxation. That's the way it is. After share your important customer data. I've shared some of actually our report is on our website. So if you visit our website, you will find many other interesting pieces also which we have done on the taxes. So if you want, I can share the link of that as well. Saeed Ahmed, for example, the Bahria Foundation is having food. Now, I'm not suggesting again that they should be stopped from doing that. The issue is not of that. Now, the Bahria Foundation, unfortunately, what has happened is that most of the businesses have now understood this concept of tax exemption and avoiding taxes. India has a regular business and a foundation or a trust.
नहीं आया
Shifa Hospital would have a Shifa
अच्छा
Hospital
तो
and a Shifa
दूसरा ट्राई
Trust.
करता हूँ
So they basically create trusts and others to park some of their transactions which otherwise could have come under the taxpayer law. And that's an unfair practice which the FDR knows most of the persons in the society knows. Since
इधर
these
रख दिया
exemptions are given at the help of the National Assembly.
ठीक
So there is a lobby going on. That's how it works. We are not against lobbying. That's their right. But the issue is that as an economist or as a policymaker, there should be some case building. There should be some document which should be public that look, this is the exemption, this is the benefit, and this is the cost benefit
मैं थोड़ा सा
analysis.
कर लेना
And
सेल्फ लिपस्टिक
after
है
a certain period, there should be some evaluation so that at the end of the day, we can decide that whether
सही
that
है ना
exemption has been
थोड़ा
good or not. Simply that is what we are
इतना वो ना
requiring.
करें
Okay जी, उसके बाद फिर next question है जनाब Naveen साहब कहते हैं कि for about 40% of the Pakistan live in the cities, yet they contribute about 50% of GDP. This that's totally true. If you look at the regional tax offices, it appears that most of the cities only pay taxes, and that is how the world wants to move ahead. But the issue is that whether we are developing our cities also in the same context. Again, as I said, that this expenditure management also needs a webinar, but this is called the incidence of expenditures, where we see that who is benefited most of the expenditure. Unfortunately, I'm not saying that the poor should not get benefit, but on a differentiation in terms of the rural and urban, the rural side takes more of government expenditure for the incidence of expenditure as compared to the urban. That is unfair from a taxation. So you're right that we need to think about the cities as the hub of the economic growth and improve upon in terms of how the resources collected from them can be returned. And normally this is done through the local governments. And unfortunately, in Pakistan, that is not. So we wish with all of you that the local bodies get elected, and sooner the better. They have the right to spend where it values the most. If you guys follow the Twitter of Five, just 2 days back, Dr. Nayab, who's our design director and pro-vice chancellor, she basically posted a picture of a underground parking plaza in Islamabad, in our supermarket, which was littered with urine and other. So basically, it was a bad project or a bad design. So had there been a local government, they would have made sure that the ownership of the project or the right spending should be. So we really need that system because without that we are not going to be able to get the most benefit. उसके बाद फिर जनाब जफर हक साहब पूछते हैं कि how can we shift the burden of the indirect taxes to the direct taxes? I would not encourage to do that because already the direct taxes are almost 50%, but within that direct taxes 70% is what they're holding. So even if the FPR agrees on this principle and within that direct taxes they are going to increase the withholding tax, that's not going to help us. So let the balance be there. 50% is good enough because the indirect taxes are also one way you must have read it in your public finance course that it's an option where we charge the income, which is the left hand side, or we charge the consumption or the future consumption, which is basically the income. So the good tax policy would always be a mixed bag of things. It cannot be simply on the direct taxes. उसके बाद then again we have आतिफ साहब आपके डिपार्टमेंट में बहुत ही ब्रिलियंट किस्म के स्टूडेंट या फैकल्टी मेंबर हैं. I'm sorry if I'm not recognizing them. So almost
Dr. Khalid, आतिफ साहब actually एक comparative advantage है questions में fiscal side पे.
अच्छा good.
One
ये
he is
फैकल्टी मेंबर है या स्टूडेंट है हमारा?
He is student. He is working on taxation issues, especially the complications in filing return.
Oh, mashallah.
In his PhD thesis.
Excellent.
And secondly, he is employed in FBR.
अच्छा तो फिर कोई अंदर की बातें बताना चाह रहे होंगे. But it's good. यही हम चाह रहे हैं. देखें, until unless the academics pick up this issue, FDR itself cannot do it. उन बेचारों के पास कितने और काम हैं. The policy making which needs certain research, which needs certain review, understanding of the theory, वो नहीं करते. उनके जो systems हैं, they do not have that much capacity. So it is the job of the academia to get in touch. जैसे हम बार बार इंडस्ट्रियल academia linkage की बात करते हैं, तो taxation is also industry of the revenue collection, and we need to partner. Atif Saab कहते हैं almost 80% exemptions are related to basic needs. I'm not saying that each one of them should go. I'm just saying that they have to be rationalized. We have to think about that what is the economic cost, and we should pick the most beneficial system. जैसे मिसाल के तौर पर मैंने भी कहा ना बेसिक इनकम सपोर्ट प्रोग्राम. अब हमारे पास अगर एक सोशल रजिस्ट्री बन गई, and we can basically provide for the welfare from that channel, then we should stop all other channels. We should stop giving subsidies to the utility stores. We should stop giving subsidies even to the electricity users of less than 300 units. We should simply focus on the basic income support. Link it with that, because that is the data on the basis of which you can confirm. For example, if you say that on the utility bill, जिसके 300 से कम units हैं, हमने subsidy दी हुई rate कम रखा हुआ. Now God knows that 300 units अगर एक बंदे ने 4 मीटर अपने लगवाए हुए हैं एक घर के अंदर, so they are going to have units rate which is going to be less than 300, whereas house is situated maybe in Hayatabad or somewhere very prime location. So we have to be very clear that what is the objective and what are the outcomes. Without that, it's not going to be possible. अच्छा उसके बाद आगे Izaz Turwali साहब कहते हैं, sir, as we know that we live in an advanced life with the help of technology, how much is it? Exactly, this is the world where we are moving towards. Technology, the digital economy and the digital taxation is the way forward. And you guys are now at that stage of your life where you can really contribute in terms of telling the FPR that how they can take advantage of that technology. Because they are not the champions of technology, they are tax persons. So we have to come out with the research which is evidence-based that this is how you can do. For example, the Green is taking lots of our public transportation or the other hassles by providing a ride-sharing method. Good for them. But how would we know that what's the exact value which they have created? Are they contributing in terms of owing the services that's come up? We really don't know, because the FPR is not that tech savvy. They don't know that how to get the data. There are persons working on the YouTube. When their subscriptions go into the millions, then they are basically generating income. But we really don't know that how much amount they are getting and from which channels. So we need to understand that system, and we have to bring them in terms of our taxation structure, because it has to be fair and equitable. You're very right, the technology is the future. Atif Saab is. Bilal, Janab, questions?
Khalid, one question from our faculty member, Dr. Danish Alam.
Thank you for such a comprehensive presentation. Very riveting indeed. But there's one thing, the elephant in the room has to be addressed as well. And it's a very lay question, not like Adif, the expert on FDR. And as you mentioned yourself, there's more than 600 pages of tax regulation and law and so on. That gives rise to a huge area where corruption takes place, and the taxman takes advantage of that knowledge that he might have which others don't, and that leads to people being afraid of, as you say, filing or giving their information or even complying to give taxes. So a lot of information that they have, and how can that be tackled? I'm sure that could also lead to the tax avoidance being reduced to quite an amount. So that was my question, which kind of looked like an elephant in the room, which I mean nobody is addressing, but it's there. So, what are your thoughts on that?
क्वेश्चन
You're
कुछ
very
कर
right,
भी रही
and
है, बहुत
this
लंबा
is
क्वेश्चन पूछ रही
something
है,
which
स्टार्ट कर दो इसको.
comes after deep thinking. That actually it is the policymakers' own wish to complicate the system as much as possible, which can create the rent-seeking option. That is something which is a very valid and correct observation. Now, what could be the solution? There have been many experiments. For example, if you guys know Dr. Asim Ijaz Khwaja, who is the professor at Harvard Kennedy School, actually they did a project here in Punjab in which they linked the pay with the performance, and the performance was related to the tax collection mechanism, where they identified that if you, let's say, have collected X amount in the last year, then in the future, if that target is achieved over and above a particular threshold, then X amount is going to go with you and your kids. Now, that is a system which initially we think does work, but what happens is that it's an incentive which is given to the individuals. Now, again, as I said, that this is where the dynamics come. They did an RCT in which they initially piloted it in few districts, and they didn't in certain districts, and difference was taken to be an evidence that look, if you link your pay with the performance, then it's going to help you in terms of, once it has been there, then it becomes part of your system, because the tax law suggests that once you have surrendered a particular taxable tax liability, that in the future then the tax liability cannot be reduced. For example, if my business says that I've surrendered 100,000 in the last year, then the next year it can be 110, but it's very difficult for you to justify that this year I'm going to file at 90,000. So that, in that sense, they did a very good RCT, and their results were. But the issue is that there was no follow-up. What has happened 5 years from that experiment? Is it there? Because the fear is that there are always options from a game theoretical perspective. That also increases the renting possibility of the taxes, where they can approach the ones which are filing their taxes by suggesting that, look, if you don't pay me this much, then I have a legal way of getting this much amount as well. That basically increases their chances of getting additional, because they know, and now the law also protects them. So what I personally feel, I'm not saying it based on any of my research or others, but it's a good question to be taken up as a PhD or a difficult topic, that how we can link the pay or the authority of the individual, because they have a better knowledge for what we in economics call as the advantage of asymmetric information, and we should stop them from taking advantage of that. But my question is that, are the FDR guys different from the other public sector? For example, the police. For example, even the policymakers, the ones which are sitting in the city administration, the DMGs, they all have an upper hand in terms of having better sets of information, the right to make policies, and giving away certain exemptions which others cannot. So that's the problem with the whole civil service. It's not just the FDR which is exclusive. But what the FDR can do is that they have their internal system as well to look after this. They have their audit and vigilance within the organization as well, where they basically have the right to look into the matters the way their field officers and others are looking. And in fact, they also identify certain such incidences as well, which are not made public, but we know from anecdotal evidence that people were actually apprehended, certain recoveries were also made, but it's not across the board. So what we suggest is that the system person is picked for an assessment, then there should be electronic dashboard of all the activities which are undertaken from that sense, which are visible to the other higher authorities or the concerned rooms as well. So that, like we use the word as an in-camera session for the parliament, it should be in-camera audit of all the audited cases, which is going to help the ones which are looking into the system in a more efficient way. So there has to be a risk of being caught within the system, so that the person sitting in the FPR does not do something which is against the laws or it's not fair. Unfortunately, you are very right. For the time being, that system is not very good. So the ultimate responsibility which the FPR is good with is that, okay, if a person is apprehended in audit, have you made the recovery? They say that, yes, sir, we have made 100% recovery, but where is the penalty? Have you actually made that person feel any guilt, and have you made him as an example? Have you publicly provided that information with the rest of the society, so that there should be a social pressure on that person that, look, he was the tax chief, because of which the others had to pay even higher taxes. So, but that sort of a system is not there. But you are very right, that needs to be brought up, and we have to think about a system where the accountability and transparency is not just for the taxpayer, but for the ones which are making these tax policies and institutions. But again, it needs research, and that is where we really want that the academics should come up. We really want that persons, let's say, pride if they can boast such a coordination, and they can play such a coordinating role, that we, as a collective unit from all the universities, are doing studies on the taxation, and then we approach the FPR in terms of our proposals, let's say, before the budget, like the other associations which are creating lobbies. If guys see the newspaper, just a week or two before, there is going to be policy proposals coming from the APTMA, policy proposals coming from the ICMA, policy proposals coming from these. These are all lobbyists, because they are protecting the interest of the ones which are trying to reduce the tax liability. So, before the budget, there should be a common faculty or an academic version of the possible budgetary and other measures also, which are based on evidence, which can help the FPR in terms of executing that policy.
वो शायद मेरे कमरे में होगी चलिए
जी
मैं
जनाब।
वहाँ को भी आके देख लूँगी
Atif
Khalid sir.
posted something on this regard, that there is an online video hearing system launched for the audit cases, but there is no physical hearing, but still online hearing system is not properly function. So he has basically vetted my. जी सर।
एक पीछे क्वेश्चन नवीद का है इनसे पहले, सेकंड लास्ट।
नवीद साहब कहते हैं जी, सर, while the agriculture sector plays hardly any taxes, manufacturing industries contribute big and more share, because not everyone files the tax. The formal sector, that is what we are saying, that this is what we call as an unfair tax system, जहाँ पे इनकम को इनकम देखना चाहिए ना, लेकिन ये बस ड्रामे है ना, मतलब which everybody knows, but they are unable to put pressure on the politician. Like for example, आप कैसे इसको कर सकते हैं? FPR खुद नहीं कर सकता, because FPR is an agent to the government. Until and unless the government asks them that please charge taxes on the income coming from the agriculture also, they cannot do it on their own. They have been suggesting it, as I've said, that the FPR chairman wrote an open letter which is publicly available to the provincial revenue authorities, that look, we are going to collect on your behalf the agriculture income tax, and then we're going to surrender it to you. But the provinces didn't agree to it. Now the idea is that that needs to be propagated. Let's say the academics basically come out with the potential of the agriculture income tax and the ways and means on how to do it. That is going to create a pressure on the legislators that, look, instead of increasing the withholding taxes on the mobile card, which is basically killing the poor, because they have to buy it if they are purchasing a 500 worth of the card, we should basically tax these billionaires which are coming from the agricultural sector. I'm not saying that everyone in the agricultural sector would be billionaire, but the ones which are billionaires should be basically taxed, because they are the prime movers in our legislation as well. Just look at the profiles of individuals. They are published in the tax directories now available at the FPR. Maybe more than 50% are coming from an agricultural background. You can just understand that the extra income which they're making here without taxation is contributing in terms of our policy making, our legislative capacities as well. This all needs to be brought in with the help of some academic group, some discussion, and some lobbying from evidence-based policy. Yes, sir.
Okay, Khalid Saab, thank you very much. It was very informative and comprehensive presentation. Now, I would like to thank you on behalf of our faculty and chairperson, Department of Economics, and thank you very much.
So it's my pleasure, and it's my pleasure.
We hope we will learn a lot more from you in future. Thank you.
Bilkul, definitely, sir. We'll have more fruitful interactions. Inshallah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.